it's astonishing that the Symphonie Fantastique exploded into the world of music when it did, only just a couple of years after Beethoven's death. I mean, it's just amazing to think of that Berlioz could come up with something so Beethovenian and yet beyond Beethoven in so short a time. And when you think that his musical antecedents were not all that glorious, I mean, he came from a not a very musical family, and that he had lessons from Le Sueur privately, and he did attend the conservatoire, but he was always absolutely in conflict with Cherubini, and who completely misunderstood his music. He had no idea of the power of his imagination. Berlioz somehow managed to acquire a very solid technique early on, and the thing that immediately strikes one in the Symphonie Fantastique is his ear for instruments. He had such an acute ear for instrumental colour, for timbre varié, and that's something that he may have learnt from Le Sueur, but it's mostly came from himself and his observation and his love of the palette, of the different palettes of orchestral colour. I mean, he would find himself going to see Adolphe Sax in his studio, where Sax was creating brand new instruments there in the 1830s. And he was completely enchanted. He was a curious mixture, Berlioz, of respecting tradition of the past and old instruments, and interested in the novelty of the latest, the most up-to-date instruments of his day. And of course, he combines the two in the Symphonie Fantastique. I mean, on the one hand, you have natural trumpets, but next to them you have cornets à piston, which are very, very new. You have ophicleide, which is an old instrument, and a serpent, which is a ridiculously old instrument, and it's used in the church. But he's using it parodistically to create the sort of horror of the dies irae in the final movement of the Symphonie Fantastique. And it's always this frisson that exists between the old and the new in his music, which I think it gives it its cutting edge. And there's no question to me that, I mean, the Symphonie Fantastique is a chef-d'œuvre. It is a masterpiece. I heard it for the first time in November 1967, played by the Orchestre de Paris, conducted by Charles Munch, at their first concert in Paris when I was a student. And I was completely blown away by it. And I've been blown away ever since. I love it to bits. And I had the huge privilege of conducting my own orchestra, the Orchestre Révolution Romantique, for a performance of the Symphonie Fantastique in the old Salle du Conservatoire in the Rue de Rome, the place where Berlioz first heard and had his Symphonie Fantastique performed. And it was very, very moving. There was only one real problem, and that is that the layout of the orchestra, which is indicated very precisely by Berlioz, exactly on the different levels, the different praticables, the different gradins, as they say, of the orchestra, they didn't fit for us because we're physically much taller than in his time. And he was 5'2". He was very small. And his instrumentalists were small, and they stood very close together. But other than that, it was a very interesting experiment to play in the original hall with instruments of his period, and it sounds wonderful. I feel passionately that Berlioz benefits from being played on instruments of his period, almost more than any other composer, except maybe Schumann, of that period, because his ear for orchestral and instrumental colour is so precise, and it demands the colour of the individual instruments that he had at his disposition. When you play him on a modern symphony orchestra, which is much more powerful, which is much more homogeneous and less varied in timbre than Berlioz's orchestra, you gain in power, but you lose in colour and you lose in perspective. And I think that's a great shame. I do conduct modern orchestras in Berlioz, but I think that the breakthrough that's already happening and will continue to happen in the public's appreciation of Berlioz will come from them listening to period instrument performances, because then you get this extraordinary range of the old and the new, and in the Symphonie Fantastique of an ophicleide next to a serpent, of natural horns, and then natural trumpets next to cornet à piston, and then the sax horns that you hear in, for instance, in the Chasse Royale, in the Trojans, Les Troyens. They bring a haunting quality, a sonority, which you don't find in any other composer of the day, and which you can't reproduce in a standard symphony orchestra.